7 minutes. In the life of a royal, that's the difference between a routine morning and a global headline. By the time the palace press office pressed send on their latest statement, phones were already buzzing, newsrooms were already shifting into high alert, and one woman inside Kensington Palace was staring at a few carefully chosen words that cut deeper than anyone outside those walls will ever truly understand. The world would call it an update. The palace would call it necessary. But for Catherine, Princess of Wales, it was something far more personal. The moment when tragic news about her youngest son stopped being an abstract fear and became a reality she had to help him carry. On the surface, the statement was restrained, almost cold in its precision. No dramatic language, no unnecessary details, just the kind of measured confirmation the monarchy prefers when emotion is running wild outside the gates. It did not mention the tears she wiped away before stepping into a briefing room. It did not spell out the long conversation she had the night before with a little boy who still thinks in colors and stories, not constitutional duty. Yet every line, every omission confirmed something that felt quietly devastating. That from this moment forward, Prince Louis's childhood would be seen through a different lens, one marked by worry, by questions, and by a kind of public curiosity no child ever asks for. When people see a title screaming tragic news about Prince Louis, their minds race to the darkest possibilities: illness, accident, scandal. That is the brutal efficiency of a digital age that turns royal children into characters in a story the audience feels entitled to rewrite. But inside the palace, tragedy is often less cinematic and more quietly cruel. It is the knowledge that a 4, 5, 6-year-old boy has already watched his great-grandmother's death become a global spectacle, his grandfather's health discussed on rolling news, and his own expressions turned into memes and analysis. The palace confirmed nothing so dramatic as the collapse some corners of the internet love to whisper about. Instead, it confirmed something in many ways harder to bear: that the storm around Louis is not going away. For the public, the words appeared first as breaking news banners and push notifications. For journalists, it was the cue to pull old footage of a laughing, cheeky little boy waving from palace balconies and sitting on his father's shoulders at jubilees. But for Catherine, the so-called tragic news was tangled up with memories the cameras never saw. The late-night hospital corridors she walked while pregnant, wondering if the hyperemesis that plagued her other pregnancies would return. The moment she had to sit George, Charlotte, and Louis down and explain that their beloved great-grandmother, the Queen, was gone forever. The far more recent day when she recorded a message to the nation about her own health, admitting to a cancer diagnosis and quietly acknowledging how carefully she and William had to choose their words for their 3 young children. In that video, she spoke to millions, but every parent watching heard the same subtext: "Before you hear this, my children have already heard it." George, old enough to read the headlines. Charlotte, sensitive enough to catch every shift in her mother's expression. And Louis, still small, still learning that sometimes grown-ups sit you down and say words you don't fully understand yet, only that they sound serious. Imagine, just for a moment, what it means for a mother to look into the eyes of a child like Louis and introduce him to the word cancer not as something abstract, but as something living in his own family, in his own home. You do not need a palace insider to guess that there were tears before and after that conversation, some of them hers, some of them his. So what did the palace actually confirm in those carefully measured lines that sent the internet spiraling? Not a secret diagnosis about Prince Louis, not a dramatic collapse hidden from the cameras. What they confirmed in plain, almost clinical language was that the Princess of Wales would be stepping back from public duties to focus on her treatment and her family, and that her children, including Louis, would be given time, space, and privacy to adjust. It sounds sensible, almost simple. Yet hidden beneath that is the quiet admission that a 6-year-old boy is now living through something millions of adults fear and struggle to process. Hidden beneath it is the understanding that his mother's public battle is his private childhood. And that is where the real tragedy lies, not in lurid whispers, but in the simple fact that Louis's most formative years are unfolding in a house where every curtain twitch is watched and every small absence becomes a story. Think back to the images the world fell in love with. Louis covering his ears during the roar of the Jubilee flypast, pulling faces on the balcony, climbing onto his grandfather's lap during the pageant as music and color swirled around them. To millions, he was instantly the relatable royal toddler, the comic relief in a centuries-old institution. Clips looped endlessly on social media, captions joked about every expression, and headlines called him cheeky, naughty, hilarious. What very few people stopped to consider was the other side of that coin. Every time his face goes viral, it reminds his parents that their smallest child does not get to grow up anonymously, make mistakes in private, or disappear from view when life becomes overwhelming. When the palace confirms that Catherine needs space to heal and to shield her children, it is a tacit acknowledgement that the line between adorable public moment and intrusive spectacle has already been crossed, and that the cost of that spectacle is being paid, day by day, inside their family home. For Kate, that quiet, relentless cost is the part of the story that will always bring tears inside. To understand why the palace's confirmation felt so devastating, you have to look beyond the headline and into the way royal stories are built, twisted, and amplified in real time. Within minutes of that statement being released, comment sections were flooded with wild theories. That Louis had secretly been taken to hospital, that his behavior at previous events had been warning signs, that Kate's absence from one engagement or another had been part of a vast, coordinated cover-up. None of those claims were in the statement. None of them were supported by evidence, yet they spread faster than the measured truth ever could. But inside Kensington, tragedy did not look like those breathless comments. It looked like a mother scrolling past the same rumors and asking herself how much of this her children would eventually see. It looked like carefully worded explanations to school staff, security teams, and close friends, making sure that Louis could still have playdates and lessons without every teacher feeling they were part of a media operation. It looked like the quiet moment after the statement went out when Catherine, according to those who know her, allowed herself to cry not because of what had been confirmed, but because of everything the world was already assuming. Here is the contrast almost no viral clip ever captures. For the internet, Louis is content. A few seconds of a funny face, an out-of-context gesture, a still frame that can be turned into a caption. For his parents, he is a small boy who asks why people he has never met know his name, why grown adults he passes in the street sometimes point, whisper, or push their phones a little higher to grab a secret photograph. When the palace confirms that his mother is stepping back and that the family is asking for privacy, it is not a PR strategy. It is a line in the sand drawn on behalf of a child. And yet, because the monarchy exists at the intersection of tradition, duty, and spectacle, even that line becomes content. Notice the way the headline you clicked works. 7 minutes ago, Palace confirms, tragic news, Prince Louis, Kate in tears. It is perfectly engineered to trigger every anxiety the modern audience has about the royals. Secrecy, sickness, suffering hidden behind palace walls. It invites you to imagine a scene even more dramatic than the truth. A late-night ambulance, doctors rushing, senior aides whispering in corridors, a distraught princess collapsing in a hospital chair. The reality, as it so often is with royal life, is both less cinematic and more quietly painful. Tragedy here is not a single shocking event, but an accumulation of moments that most families endure in private, and this one must navigate under a spotlight. It is Louis asking why Mummy is not coming to an engagement she promised they would watch on television together. It is Catherine deciding whether to show him the video message she recorded before or after it airs, weighing up whether seeing it first on a screen will make it feel more distant or more frightening. It is William choosing which school events to attend alone, calculating how each appearance or absence will be interpreted by people who have never met his children but feel entitled to dissect their lives. This is where the palace's language, so often mocked as stiff or evasive, takes on a different meaning. When they write of time and space, for the family, they are not only protecting their own image, they are trying to build a small, invisible fence around a boy who does not yet fully grasp why strangers have opinions about his face. When they stress that Kate's focus is on her recovery and her children, they are signaling to the most aggressive corners of the press that there is a line they should not cross, even if they know some will step over it anyway. And when they decline to add color or drama, it is not because there is none, but because the people most affected are too young to consent to having their pain turned into detail. Of course, history casts a long shadow over all of this. The palace knows better than anyone how speculation about royal children can spiral into something darker. It remembers a teenage Diana chased down streets, her school gates staked out, her every gesture used to fuel an insatiable narrative. It remembers William and Harry walking behind their mother's coffin while the world watched, two boys carrying a grief that would echo for decades in interviews, memoirs, and arguments about who failed to protect them. That memory is not abstract for the current Prince and Princess of Wales. It is the blueprint of what they are determined not to repeat with their own children, especially the youngest, whose carefree expressions have already made him a favorite target of cameras. So when you read that the palace has confirmed tragic news about Prince Louis and that Kate has been left in tears, understand the layers beneath that phrase. Yes, there are tears, of fear, of exhaustion, of love sharpened by the knowledge that nothing she does will ever completely shield her son from public scrutiny. Yes, there is tragedy, not in a sensational secret, but in the way an ordinary family crisis becomes international content the moment it touches a royal roof. And yes, there is confirmation, not of the most lurid theories, but of something quieter and in its own way more devastating. That a 6-year-old boy, who should be worrying about spelling tests and playground games, is instead learning what it means to be both a child and a symbol. 7 minutes after the palace presses send on a statement, the world thinks it knows his story. But the truth is that most of his real story will never be written in any press release, and the hardest parts of it play out in rooms where cameras will never be allowed. Perhaps the most uncomfortable truth for anyone watching this story unfold is that, in a way, we are part of the tragedy we claim to pity. Every click on a dramatic headline, every share of a rumor dressed up as an update, adds weight to the pressure pressing in on a little boy and his exhausted parents. 7 minutes after the palace confirms anything at all, the narrative is no longer in their hands. It belongs to the people who benefit from making it louder, darker, more shocking than it really is. And yet, there is another choice available, one the palace itself has been struggling to model in recent years. The choice to look at these children not as characters in a royal soap opera, but as human beings growing up in circumstances none of us would willingly choose for our own family. When you study the way William and Catherine have raised George, Charlotte, and Louis so far, you see a deliberate pattern emerging. School runs in ordinary cars. Parents' evenings attended like any other mother and father. Birthdays marked with photos taken by Kate herself rather than staged shoots in palace gardens. Appearances at big state occasions followed by long stretches of invisibility where the children are allowed to be just that, children. This is not an accident. It is a reaction, almost a quiet rebellion, against the childhoods their parents and grandparents endured when every milestone and misstep became public property. For Louis, that strategy is both a blessing and a burden. The more his parents shield him, the more curious parts of the world become. The less the palace explains, the more imaginative the speculation grows. Here again we find a contrast worth holding in our minds. On one side is the image people project onto him. The cheeky prince, the wild card on the balcony, the living meme whose every expression is instantly dissected. On the other is the reality inside the Wales household. A youngest child who, like so many, is working out who he is in the shadow of older siblings, trying on confidence one day and shyness the next, loud at home and overwhelmed in crowds. To the public, tragic news might sound like some hidden, dramatic secret finally exposed. To his mother, tragedy is the day he first realizes that a bad mood, a clumsy moment, or a private struggle could end up replayed a million times by people who have never heard his laugh when the cameras are off. The palace cannot write that into a statement. It cannot confess that part of the reason Kate was left in tears is that she can see, far more clearly than most, the long road ahead for her son. A life in which every girlfriend, every school change, every missed engagement will be analyzed for signs of scandal or weakness. A future where his relationship with his parents and siblings will be compared, measured, and judged against standards no ordinary family could bear. She knows this because she has watched it happen to William, to Harry, to herself. She understands that even her illness, something so starkly human and frightening, has already been twisted into storylines that barely resemble the truth. If that can happen to an adult princess, what chance does a 6-year-old have of keeping any part of his inner world truly his own? So where does that leave us? 7 minutes after the latest palace confirmation, with the words Prince Louis and tragic news still hanging in the air. It leaves us with a choice about how we engage. We can keep feeding the cycle that turns a little boy's life into entertainment, or we can decide to treat that phrase with the gravity it deserves. Tragic news, in this context, is not that Louis has become a character in some dark fairy tale. It is that his mother is unwell, that his routines have been shaken, that he is being asked to develop resilience years earlier than most of us ever had to. It is tragic that a family cannot simply close the front door and grieve, worry, hope, and heal without millions of eyes pressing against the metaphorical glass. When the palace confirms that Catherine is focusing on treatment and on her children, it is, in its own restrained way, a plea. Not only to the press, but to people like us, watching from afar. A plea to let Prince Louis be more than the sum of headlines that mention his name. A plea to understand that behind every royal update, There are school bags to be packed, bedtime stories to be read, questions to be answered in phrases a child can bear. A plea ultimately to remember that however gilded the surroundings, the emotions playing out are intensely familiar. Fear for a loved one, hope for recovery, the sting of knowing you cannot carry all of someone else's pain for them, no matter how desperately you want to. As you move on from this video, you get to choose what story you carry with you. You can chase the next sensational headline, or you can hold on to the quieter truth. That behind the palace gates, Prince Louis is not a symbol of scandal or mystery, but a little boy facing a complicated world with the help of parents who are determined, despite everything, to let him laugh, play, and grow. If you want to follow this story in a way that honors that reality, stay with channels that question, that contextualize, that remember the humans behind the crowns. Because 7 minutes after the next announcement, the flood will start all over again. The difference, this time, is that you will know how to read between the lines. And that, more than any whispered rumor or dramatic headline, is the real story behind today's announcement. A royal family asking to be seen not as symbols of spectacle, but as human beings carrying very human burdens together, too.